It's generally a privilege for me to be able to talk about these subjects, let alone talk about them for longer than 5 minutes. So I thank you for your attention. As well as the ability, as John said, for me to not only talk about the subject matter as it applies to your work, but ground it in a larger social context of why that work's important, why that work is needed and required. And a major research project that we did at MetaViews is looking at the future of authority. And I'll elaborate on that in a bit, but it obviously sort of frames a lot of the comments I'm going to offer. And again, the importance and the value, I think, of the work that you guys can do. And as a society, I find that there is a general anxiety about where we're going, what direction society is headed. Partly as a symptom of the accelerating culture that's a byproduct of the rapid rate of technological change. And as someone who grew up and studied here in Toronto, I was greatly influenced by Marshall McLuhan, who's a media theorist, English professor, also happens to be his 100th anniversary this year, although obviously he's deceased. And he had a great concept of the rear view mirror, that society moves so quickly that what we perceive as the present is really the past, and what we see as the future is really the present. And it speaks especially true in terms of people's relationship with social media. That often it's a perception, especially one being a very subjective media, that it's varied. I mean, people who use it think of it as normal. People who don't use it think of it as foreign and something shiny. And I'm assuming that I'm dealing with a very broad literacy range of levels. So what I want to do before getting into the explicit tools and the explicit application is give you a sense of my own philosophical framework of how I understand technology and society. And it's really driven by the question of where are we going and who's driving this change. And I think part of it is clear that it's mobile technology, it's smartphones, that at this point certainly took the web to a next level, was, I believe, the main engine of social media as a phenomenon, in that, as someone who was on the web in the early 90s, mid-90s, when there was lots of interactivity, no one actually called that social media. You didn't have the same types of Facebook, Twitter applitions that arguably aren't any new technology. It's a cultural shift, not a technological shift. And it's driven, I believe, by the smartphone and the fact that you can have these powerful computers in your pocket, but that are not limited to the first world. And in fact, finally unites the world onto a level playing field. And in fact, teenagers did this on their own. That, they use text messages, in some cases sending hundreds of messages a day, because it is the lowest common denominator, because it is the system that allows them to reach their friends when and where they have to. And so smartphones and our seduction of smartphones speaks a lot to the opportunities, especially around surveillance, in that they're part of how there's so much data, so much raw material that you can use in terms of crunching and understanding our world. But data is not enough. And that's where it's important to recognize the need for socialization. That successful technology comes with culture. And that is really where social media is a driver. That it's a response to the tsunami of information that the web has unleashed. It's a response to the need to look at the internet as a learning curve. That it's a place where you're constantly learning new things, and it's infinitely easier with the help of your friends. But it also is changing the way that as a democratic society we relate to each other. And part of it, certainly on the youth level, has to do with the saturation of advertising. That many young people are actually immune to ads. That they have this sixth sense that allows them to detect when someone's trying to manipulate them. And so what you're seeing instead is a return to recommendations. They're still consumers, they still buy stuff, they still have political ideas, but they turn to their friends in terms of how those are shaped. They turn to their friends in terms of how to decide what to purchase. And that's created the phenomenon of these micro-celebrities. That every campus, every community, every workplace has someone who is that influential model, that small A authority, and who advertisers and marketers are actually targeting quite aggressively, which, if you're interested, is a tangent for afterwards. But it speaks to the way in which, as we regard authority and influence in society, it's shifting. And all of this, of course, is rather ironic, because the nature of this new media is very subjective, and it yields an insular culture. If you think about it, when people leave the house, when they go outside, more often they plug in to a type of virtual reality. That rather than be exposed to the sights and sounds of the world around them, they'd rather have that personal soundtrack. And when people go online to seek culture, they rarely look for people who are going to disagree with them. but instead seek out those who will reinforce their worldview. And this is a very dangerous bias to the media, in which there's a great book out currently called The Filter Bubble that describes how all of this creates an effect in which you're isolating people into essentially insular tribes, insular cultures, which it's very difficult to, for example, pursue a notion of public health. And I'll elaborate that on a bit. But it's something that you need to overcome within constructing your own research networks. And it was interesting in hearing the work group's report that there was a notion both of inclusivity and the need for those social ties, but also a need to try to make sure you're not the same suspects, to make sure that you're increasing that internal diversity, especially when it comes to perspectives and point of view. And that's where research can start to break down, where you're not conscious about how to nurture that type of interaction. The irony of it all is that it's really shifting into what I'm talking about in terms of this project of the future of authority. That it's creating new authorities. And in fact, when you talk to people in terms of how they relate to authority, it's usually one of distrust. And so when I was talking about that culture of insularity, where this plays out is, for example, around vaccines, is around the distrust of public health officials. Unnecessarily so, rarely rooted in science. But take H1N1, for example. There was an incredible paranoia of distrust against the immunization, of distrust against the authorities who were delivering that immunization, unnecessarily so. And many of the people I know who refused to get immunized did get very sick. Not as sick as some of the worst cases, but sick enough, especially in I was born in 1974, so it was in the sort of target range of people who've never been exposed to it. You know, I know folks who had 5-6 weeks off because they were dealing with it, and they didn't bother to get immunized, even though here in Ontario it was free and anyone could get it. And it speaks to how, in fact, there is a need to develop this new authority. And what my research has led me so far to believe is that it's cognitive authorities. People still trust experts. They distrust institutions. So there's often contradictions when you're the expert who's representing an institution. But the new authority on an organizational level are networks, which speaks to this issue of recognition, which speaks to this issue of larger organizational identity. That in fact, when 1,000 researchers participate in a project, it's the network itself that's receiving the recognition. And the authority of that network directly translates to the participants of that network. So certainly for the intermediate level, even junior level researchers who may be in medical school, it's a benefit of them merely by association. But it starts to speak to the opportunity that network, that those of you as individuals in that network, as cognitive authorities have as a role to play in this society. And it's a role that, you know, in an open society seems fairly straightforward, but it's not entirely visible. But the subtext is there danger lurking in the clouds? You know, and part of that danger stems from that insularity, but part of it also stems really from the notion in which society moves so quickly that there isn't time to do the type of research. There isn't time to respond. And where we have now is an opportunity between pandemics to create that time, to create that opportunity. Now, Douglas Rushkoff, who's a New York-based media theorist, has an excellent book out right now called Program or Be Programmed. And it really speaks to the existential opportunity that the internet affords us. That on the one hand, its messages we can make our reality. On the other hand, it's driving in such a way that no one ever takes up that opportunity. That most people tend to, you know, in the sort of passive relationship we have with the screen, allow the world to pass them by. But we here, present in this room, are in a particular opportunity to embody what Rushkoff calls, in terms of his notion of the power of the program. Now, he describes the sort of shifts of media that, you know, in the era of the Gutenberg Bible or the era of the Gutenberg Press, few people were authors. You know, even few were actually readers. But if you think about it in terms of the era of television, when television came about, few people actually made television. So here we are in the era of the internet, and true power is in the programmer, and yet few people program. Most people are users, sort of passive engagement of the system. But what Rushkoff does, and this is sort of in a McLuhan tradition of playing with language, is he notices that computer programmers aren't the only programmers. You know, someone who works in radio or television is a programmer, a big program culture. An educator is a programmer, and then they create curriculum. And certainly a researcher is a programmer in terms of creating and programming a research project. That often has very tangible, very substantive results. So it's an idea of embracing this existential challenge, that we can create this reality. We can actually create models, create networks, create new models of authority that start to actually, instead of in a passive way, be dragged with society, start to determine where we want it to go, to be the type of open society that we wish it to be.